Thanks a lot for joining us today. My name is Claudia Breitung. I work for BICC, and I'm the project manager of this project. I'm not alone here today. We have a couple of colleagues in the room and in the virtual room. And yeah, with this, I hand over to Boubacar. So maybe the colleagues briefly introduce themselves, starting with Boubacar. You have to come here, I think, to speak to the mic.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Happy to be here and nice to meet you. My name is Boubacar Haidara, senior researcher at BICC, part of this project on armed group on Sahel, and also involved in other project at BICC on the Nexus Humanitarian Development and Peace. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Boubacar. We have two more colleagues from BICC in the virtual room as well. I hand over to them, maybe starting with Milena.
Yes, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Milena. I'm also working in the project at BICC. And maybe I also take the opportunity to make reference to two other colleagues because we're together covering the Chad component. So it's Mr. Nenek Alakaus and Alyum Tondandi, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, but just by reference also introducing them virtually. Thanks.
Thanks. And then we have Amélie from BICC as well here.
Good afternoon. My name is Amélie Flipsenburg, and I am working as a student assistant in the project. Thank you.
Thanks, Amélie. And as Milena has already mentioned, we don't implement this project alone, but together with esteemed partners in the Sahel, starting with Crash in Chad. But we also have our colleague with us from Nigeria. Mustafa, over to you.
Hello, colleagues. Good morning, and I'm happy to be here. My name is Mustafa Al-Hassan. I was the project consultant from Nigeria supporting this project. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and usually, I'm not sure if he's in the virtual room. I can't see him. There's also Professor Adama from the University of Marua in Cameroon, but I don't think he was able to connect. Okay, maybe he will join us later. Yeah, today we are here to briefly introduce the project, what we are doing in the project, and of course we will also share some research insights with you. So we're going to speak a little bit about the project objectives. What do we actually want to achieve with this kind of research? And we dive specifically into the conflict dynamics into the Lake Chad Basin. This is not the only region we are covering in the Sahel. I will speak later to that, what are our regional border complexes that we investigate. But for this presentation, we chose Lake Chad Basin as a focus area. And we will specifically, as Andreas has mentioned, talk about armed groups in the region and talk about the regional approaches specifically to Boko Haram and ISWAP, which are two extremist group operating in the area. And hopefully by the end, in the end, we also have a chance to then answer some questions you may have on the project. In terms of objectives, we really look into the regional dynamics of conflict in border regions in the Sahel, and look at ongoing approaches that are taken towards armed groups, specifically non-state armed groups. As mentioned, we don't do this alone, so there's a strong collaboration between BICC and the universities and research institutions in the Sahel, and I'm mentioning this specifically because we deem this important, because it was very important to us that all the researchers are involved in the research from A to Z, so basically starting from the research design to data collection, data analysis, and then eventually to the production of the research results. In the end, we aim to formulate recommendations on how to deal with armed groups in the Sahel. And this is a very pragmatic approach. And this is also because we don't do this project just as the research institutions here in the room, but it's a joint project we implement together also with the African Union and the Department of Peace Operations of the UN, which is responsible for DDR operations worldwide. We've been collaborating with these two institutions. If you know BICC, we are always sort of on the border to also policy and advice, and this is really more on the advisory side. This project, I would say. Our research questions are the following. So first of all, we ask what are the central characteristics in the conflict systems in the border complexes under investigation. And you will note that we deliberately talk about conflict systems. So what we're trying to do with this research is not to just look at the modus operandi of armed groups, but we also try to look left and right, try to look at the components that are really important and that are describing conflict in these border spaces, starting from the political landscape, the social, ethnic compositions, and of course, we also dive deeper into the economic developments in these spaces, because all of these are very deeply connected with the modus operandi, or with how, or connected to how armed groups are operating. We then ask what is the role of these actors in these conflict systems, trying to better understand how are they collaborating with each other, how are they collaborating with other external actors, and maybe also actors that don't come to mind at first hand. So what are, for instance, the connections to what we call in the area the big man, the politicians in the area. So really trying to map these actors and try to understand the linkages. And then last but not least, I already alluded to that, we ask the question how existing programming should or can be redesigned to be more effective and sustainable, because we do see a lot of gaps in the ongoing programming that is implemented in the Sahel, that is targeted towards these actors. We try to come up with the recommendations, and given that we work with the African Union and also United Nations, we already have our first target group in the project itself. Last year, we did collect the necessary data in the countries you can see here on the map. Obviously, we had to narrow it down. The Sahel is very wide, it's many countries. So we are focusing mostly on Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon in our research. Initially, the idea was also to focus on Niger. We were just talking about it. But given that this is a project which is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, we were very clearly told that as of now, we cannot conduct any research in Niger through this project. So unfortunately, we had to drop this in the course of the implementation of the project. Who knows, maybe eventually we will be able to also conduct research there, but this is not yet on the table. You will see here the areas where we did conduct research. It's mostly the border regions, Cameroon, Nigeria, Chad, which is the Lake Chad Basin, but then we also covered the border Chad, Sudan, and also Chad and Central African Republic and Chad, Libya. So but colleagues will speak to that. We followed a mixed methods approach. So basically conducting semi-structured interviews, expert interviews, did a large number of focus group discussions, 316 in total. And in addition to that, we also implemented a large-scale survey where we were able to reach 20 border provinces and more than 40 border localities. I have to stress that we did conduct this kind of research in very insecure and volatile regions, so sometimes very difficult to access regions, where even humanitarians, NGOs, they really struggle to get that kind of access, and other research institutions as well. For us, so we were able to go there physically to these spaces, but with the only caveat that in Chad, in the Northern Triangle, their security was really that bad that we couldn't go. So there we did telephone interviews. This is a quick overview of the survey, which we did, the quantitative survey. We just want to show this here to give you a little bit of a better picture. Who was our target group? Who did we target with this kind of research? You will see there's many different ethnic groups we were able to speak to. Sorry, it's very small. I hope you see it from the back. If not, no. Okay, sorry. But maybe the presentation can be shared afterwards as well. So large number of ethnic groups, different communities. This also, given the high number of different languages that are spoken in these spaces, we had to partner with many local assistants who speak the local languages. Obviously, we don't necessarily all of us speak. Some of them do, of course. Our colleagues are coming from the region, but so yeah, this was required to really get firsthand information. And yeah, gender balance, obviously, yeah, it's not as mixed as we would have wanted it to do, but this is also connected to the fact that it was more difficult to reach the female part of the population in these spaces. But I think given the challenges, we did somehow well. The implementation status currently is as follows. We did, after the data collection, start to distill our research findings and try to already disseminate into the relevant policy systems. We have already drafted 3 policy briefs, which we will also relate to in this presentation. 2 more are coming out soon. And then the idea is also to come up with a comparative study, which then compares the findings from the different border regions. In terms of dissemination activities, I mentioned that AU and UN, they are of course our main target group, but there's others. So as BICC, we closely collaborate also with national DDR commissions on the continent. Of course, they will also be the actors where we are trying, or with whom we are trying to share research findings, and there's others as well. Eventually, we are also going to have a podcast series, which is something new to our project team. This will hopefully come out towards the end of the year. And with this, I now dive a little bit deeper, or we dive a little bit deeper, because I hand over now to my colleague Milena Berks to also share with you some of the preliminary research findings. And with this, over to you, Milena.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. So as you mentioned, let's look a bit at the data that we have collected, both the quantitative and qualitative. So first of all, interesting that we actually use the understanding of borderlands, so as spaces of mutual exchange, both when it comes to trade relations, social relations. So basically these interconnections, right, like between communities across border areas. However, what we see is that the regional dynamics of this cross-border mobility, including these traditional trade and transhumance routes, that are also characteristics of the socioeconomic strength of the region, are increasingly hampered by the growing insecurity that non-state armed actors produce. So what we were interested in here is to first understand what is the frequency, so to say, of this mobility. And I hope, I guess it's once again very small for you guys in the room. So let me maybe give some sense to the colors here. So on the left side, you see a question of the survey on how often respondents actually cross the border. So here you see the big yellow part, which is actually once per month. So you see it's still for all countries quite frequent. However, you see some differences. In Chad, so to say, it's actually less. So people cross less. And in Nigeria, more often. So you see the dark blue is actually once per week. So you see that for Nigeria is actually increased. And this is also linked to the other graph that you see on the other side. Actually, how safe people do feel when crossing. So these actually nicely speak to one another, because in Nigeria, people actually do feel more safe, as you see in the lighter blue and dark blue parts of the graph. In Chad, less so, and Cameroon in both is somewhere in the middle. So this is actually something that we now want to give also a bit more sense to when it comes to the security issues. So the next graph actually shows us what communities actually do perceive as serious issues regarding security in their respective communities. So you see, once again, Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon. For Nigeria, very prominent Boko Haram, as well as ISWAP, but also banditry, and to a lesser extent as well, the herder-farmer dimension, that's the orange line that you see here, and also other non-state armed groups. You see it's more prominent in Chad when it comes to banditry, the red one, and also herder-farmer dynamics. That's maybe also something we might come back to in the question and answer section when it comes to the geographical distribution of respondents, actually, because in Chad we also had a large number of respondents in the south of Chad, where obviously the herder-farmer dimension is very, very strong here. And in Cameroon, you see that Boko Haram, of course, is also an issue, as well as banditry, so the red one and the dark blue line that you see here. Let's maybe look at some of the aspects that also came out more strongly through our qualitative research. So we have a couple of factors, and we hope that's not overwhelming. So looking forward as well to the question and answer section to maybe go deeper into some of these elements. One factor is definitely the ethnic dimension to things, where we see that while national security forces leveraged on multinational approaches, non-state armed groups clearly utilize a trans-border ethnically oriented approach, also recruiting members from similar ethnic identity, who also oftentimes have a better understanding, right, of the areas where they're operating. This exploitation by groups, you can also see that irrespective of the type of group, they exploit local grievances, socioeconomic disparities, and also governance deficits to recruit followers and to expand also their influence, which actually further destabilizes the region. And finally, also the mistrust and stigmatization aspect among ethnic groups is very, very strong. You can observe deep mistrust and fierce rivalry in context of scarce resources, and we're going to come to that in a second. Long-standing conflict issues among the community when it comes to also identifying and sometimes finger-pointing armed violence. I'm just mentioning for those of you who have done research in the region, very recurrent is, of course, the stigmatization of the Buduma communities, which are often cited as members of Boko Haram. Maybe with that, let's move over to the dimension of natural resources. Of course, climate change has played a significant role here when it comes to intense fighting over not only access to water, but also farmland. You remember when it comes to the significant issue of security, herder-farmer dimension, very prominent here. What is important to see and also worrying is the evolution, let's say, or the transformation of this conflict into more and more violent conflict. As you see here, 45%, 41% in Cameroon, 26% in Nigeria actually indicate that these conflicts become more and more violent with high numbers of death. What is important from the structural perspective here is the setup, so to say, of legal frameworks who are actually dealing with these questions, meaning land ownership, access to land, etc. And many respondents actually, 42% Nigeria, 51% in Chad, and 52% in Cameroon, do say that these laws who actually govern these dimensions are not adequate to actually respond to the current situation. So you have, in many cases, actually legal frameworks that date back to the 60s, who are obviously not, let's say, able to answer to these current challenges and also how the conflicts have evolved. Last but not least, it's also let's say, when it comes to local conflict resolution mechanisms and how we respond actually to these challenges, that we also see the politics come into play, also when it comes to public figures who actually play a role in fueling conflict in these areas. Oftentimes, of course, also in, at least for us, let's say, responses by also international organizations, we oftentimes hear, right, how important it is to involve local conflict resolution mechanisms, in particular when it comes to traditional leaders. However, these results kind of indicated to us that it's very important to look very closely on the local power dynamics when it comes to the involvement also of these, so to say, public figures, be it national authorities, so from the state side, but also traditional authorities who can sometimes have an adversant role, so to say, in these settings. Last but not least, and my colleagues will speak more about this, is the question of who actually does provide security in these areas. So we see actually that where in particular state presence is weak, and also when it comes to state security forces, communities tend to turn to other more localized mechanisms, in particular when it comes to vigilante groups, hunters, who actually provide protection in the absence of this adequate state presence and support. So these are just a few dynamics. Of course, these are also all interlinked. But with that, I hand it over to Boubacar for the dynamic of banditry and jihadi groups. Over to you, Boubacar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the next section, which represent one of represents one of our main findings, concern a relatively new notion or concept of jihadi banditry. Our colleague Oye, I guess he is well known here, would have been the best person to present this part, because he has been the most involved in data collection on this issue. But as is off, I will do that. So now, place to jihadi banditry. You know that in the Sahel, especially in the areas where we have the proliferations of armed groups, the arms groups used to be distinct, many but distinct. You have jihadist group, they have a clear objective. You have community militias, also called vigilante group, which have the clear objective. You have criminal, ordinary bandit, etc. These groups can have relationship. They can be linked each to other due to mutual interest. For example, jihadist group can act like a conveyor for drug, and in exchange they get money, or they can buy a weapon from the armed traffickers. But they used to say this to stay distinct. Jihadist and bandit is bandit, drug traffickers is drug traffickers. But in many countries in the Lake Chad Basin, especially in Nigeria, we have a new phenomenon where it is becoming difficult to make a clear distinction between jihadists and bandit. This was not the case before. And Boko Haram and also armed group associated to it, for example, ISWAP, Islamic State in West Africa province, they have been greatly weakened due to the different military operations undertaken against them. So this is at the base of this change. While Boko Haram is getting weakened, at the conversely, we observed in the same area formerly controlled by Boko Haram an increase of banditry. Boko Haram activities is decreasing, at the same time banditry is increasing in the same area Boko Haram used to control. And oh, sorry. Yes. Yes. So maybe we have to briefly define what we heard by jihadist and bandit. Jihadist, to define it very easily, jihadists are actors armed based on ideology, and who want to conduct an holy war according to themselves. For Boko Haram, it was even clearer because the objective was to establish a caliphate, Islamic State. It was very clear since the beginning. And bandits are individuals or groups engaged in various forms of criminal activities who use violence to achieve their goal, but without any ideology behind the activities. So these are the difference. So what did we find as a reason for this change in tactics from Boko Haram? Firstly, because jihadists can fly under the radar of security forces, defense and security forces, when they act like bandits. Because in the view of the security forces, even the state, bandits are less concerned than the jihadists because they don't have any political claim. So it's a way for them, because they lose many forces, to act like bandit. This is the first. The second is very pragmatic, to secure resources. They target cross-border traders. They kidnap traders against ransom. They also rob their property or steal the livestock from the cattle breeder. In addition, in the camp they are still present in, they face a shortage of food. So one of the main activity now is to invade the farmer land, to steal the harvest from the farmers, to bring that in their camp. So Boko Haram is clearly in the former areas he used to control, is acting like bandit right now. And our colleagues Oye has designed a map to show this. These are some localities formerly controlled by Boko Haram. And now, from the interviews conducted with the local people, you can see here how the two dynamics overlaps, banditry and jihadism. Yeah. Now, as policy recommendation to face this relatively new phenomenon, we recommend to prioritize local perspective on evolving security risk, including jihadi banditry, because it's when the programs are designed for a specific groups, when the group change, the objectives change, the modus operandi change, and then the program has to be adapted. So we think that this has to be taken into account. And also service provision needs to be strengthened in areas reclaimed from the armed group, and in areas where military operations are still ongoing. And also, lastly, to ensure swift and sure justice in ongoing local resource dispute that jihadi entities exploit. This last point, everywhere, whether it is in the Lake Chad Basin Commission countries and also in the West African Sahel countries, exploiting the frustration due to justice has been one of the main entry points of jihadists into communities, to exploit this and to gain the trust of this community, which make the fight against this group difficult when they get support of the communities. So this is the end of this part. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Boubacar. And you have already alluded to the fact that there's many different armed actors in the region who operate there, including also vigilante groups, which is a very important phenomenon. We also reflected upon in the research, and where Mustafa will hopefully have a chance, if we hear you properly, to talk about this further. Over to you, Mustafa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia. So I think a lot of my colleagues have mentioned this idea of a local security architecture. Claudia had mentioned at the very beginning about the number of policy briefs that we had done. One of the policy briefs we did was a policy brief on the jihadi banditry phenomenon that Boubacar just mentioned. But also another policy brief was on the vigilante group and local security architecture issue. It was important to write this brief, particularly because across all of the border complexes that we conducted this research. So the border complexes are essentially communities who share borders across the Sahel and the Lake Chad region that we conducted this research. We found one form of a local security architecture or the other. So in some cases, you had state-sponsored groups, as well as either religious-sponsored groups or market association-sponsored groups, or even local initiatives of people there. This in itself was an eye-opener. And when we sat to discuss across all of the complexes, everyone came to the realization that there was something about the vigilantes being a significant issue in the region. In some cases, in places like Chad, you have groups who are defying the state. This is the BICC group. But you also have, in some cases, you have vigilantes that are voluntary and also some that are involuntary in their recruitment. And I'll explain to some extent. In some cases, you have where people had little or no choice but to join vigilante groups, either to protect their families, to protect their farms, but also to provide a level of security intelligence in providing knowledge, in providing information to state actors. I think Milena mentioned earlier the issue of vigilantes being recruited across different groups due to certain dynamics. And in one of those cases, this is what happens. Across board, they have different types of functions. One of them that I have mentioned is the local intelligence gathering, but they've been significantly useful in the issue of highlighting early warning systems. They help in apprehending criminals. As a matter of fact, one of the communities we had visited in the Nigeria-Niger border, they were on high alert as at the time where the coup had just happened in Niger, but also they had essentially, excuse me, had apprehended a number of people who they thought were suspicious and been in the bush for over 15 to 20 days. So the vigilantes had arrested these individuals and brought them to the local traditional leaders' house. And this leads into the issue of protection and security, as well as other law and other functions, because these are some of the roles that the vigilantes particularly play, and also participate in patrols. But in many of these cases, one could argue that is essentially the fact that the presence of the state is not necessarily felt, which is why these vigilantes exist. But across these complexes and from our broader understanding of the vigilantes, we highlighted 3 significant gaps, and this is in the policy brief I mentioned as well. And these gaps essentially led to the issue of the recommendations that we made. The first gap is that, so across board, one of the things we found was that there was no clear rules of engagement or harmonized rules while dealing with vigilante groups. While for our research, we looked at things from a very regional perspective, even across countries, they do not necessarily have the same type of rules of engagement. So like I did mention, there are varying forms of vigilantes. And in some cases, you find that vigilantes that are sponsored by the state, their modus operandi or their rules of engagement is entirely different from those sponsored by either individuals or other associations. At a regional level, the disparity is even much more. And we do recommend that it's important to harmonize these rules of engagement while dealing with vigilantes. This essentially will help in many other issues, whether it's in issues of training, whether it's in issues of having a combined and a much more regional and holistic approach in dealing with the issue at hand. The second issue we found a significant gap was that state authorities were utilizing vigilantes as part of their operations. And as such, there was a significant issue of risk transfer. And as such, we would love for that to be improved. So we recommend that the risk transfer management is improved while engaging with vigilantes. In many cases, vigilantes had been conscripted to join in actual battle, and without any duty of care from many of the people engaging them in such risk that is transferred. And then the last gap that we found and we made a recommendation towards was the issue of an exit strategy. We observed that there was no comprehensive exit strategy across the region. And we recommended essentially that as a long-term solution, it was important to essentially provide these comprehensive exit strategies. It's important to note that the vigilante structure and some of the findings of our work also highlighted the significant role that these vigilantes play, especially at the community level, where they have significant trust and buy-in from local communities, and are also utilized by the local traditional governing structures. And many of these issues also deal with, also have their own pros and cons. So I'll stop here. Thank you, and over to you, Claudia.
Thanks a lot, Mustafa, for this outline and more details on the vigilante groups in the region. We also promised you in the beginning that we would also speak about the responses that are taken towards Boko Haram and ISWAP, which we will do now in the maybe next 5 minutes if we still have time. Okay, we try to do this very briefly to run you through some of the findings that we deem relevant overall. If you look at existing programming on disarmament, demobilization, rehabilitation, reintegration that is targeted at these actors, many people actually don't know about it. In the localities where we conducted the research, more people seem to know about it in Nigeria. Very few people were aware of it in Chad, as you can see, which actually resonates or is closely connected to the fact that the DDRRR programming in Chad is not as advanced as in Nigeria, for instance. So there's sort of a mismatch or difference in how the countries are implementing these programs, or to what extent they were able to come up with activities to make sure that people, when they get out of the groups, when they exit the groups, they don't return. I'll leave it at that maybe, and talk a little bit more about the regional dimension, because this is, of course, the angle of our research. And we do, besides the fact that there is a difference in the level of perception and the level of awareness of these programs are also implemented differently. In Cameroon, for instance, we have an amnesty regulation where basically the Cameroonian government says everyone can get out, so you will not be prosecuted. While in Nigeria, we have a process in place which has screening criteria where people, first of all, before they are allowed into such a program, are screened. Some of them go to prison. Those that are not going to prison then are taken to rehabilitation or reception sites. So difference in approaches, which of course is counterproductive in an area where people anyway move back and forth the borders. So this is something we deem very relevant, we found striking in our research, is this high mobility, which Milena outlined in the beginning. Of course, this applies to the average citizen, but also the armed groups who are really using these spaces to gain financial benefits, to recruit people, and borders don't stop them, obviously. And these different approaches by the countries are also mirrored by the approaches that are taken by the international community. So we do see differences in how entities like the UN are operating in the region. There's a lot of infighting, I would even say, between these entities on sort of which approach should be taken. Is it SPRR, so screening, prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration, or more DDR responses, those that are more focused on prosecutional procedures? Others are more reintegration focused. And this, of course, does not really play into the hands of the people that really want to improve the situation. We also were able to visit many of the rehabilitation centers that are that were set up to harbor the people that exit the groups that exit Boko Haram and ISWAP. Here you can see one in Cameroon, in Mary. This is actually a former prison, which they then turned into a rehabilitation center. On the picture, you can maybe guess, but when you are there, you actually begin to sense also the difficulties in sustaining these centers because the hygiene situation was a bit questionable. Let me say it's like this. Same as in Bonn in Chad, you see structures which are then not really well furnished, and this then last but not least, operational transit center also in Bonn, just a tent. So there's obviously big challenges in terms of funding, getting the right activities in place to support people that are coming out of the groups. In many cases, people are in these reception centers for a long time. So we were speaking to people in Mary in the center, and they've been there for years, which of course from a reintegration perspective is again questionable because they don't really have a vision of what's coming. In Cameroon currently, there is discussion that there's another site being opened, which is more better structured, which offers more facilities, etc. But this is a long process, and again, of course, this does not play out positively because people are recruited back into the groups. The groups, ISWAP, Boko Haram, also very closely monitor what's going on in the rehabilitation centers. This is quite counterproductive. Ties to the groups are maintained. Maybe a few words on gender and also one word on transitional justice we would like to share with you. The gender dynamics are also quite striking, we found, because we heard that women actually play a striking role in convincing people to come out, to leave the groups, to defect. And we were told by communities that it's actually often the mothers who try to establish contact to the groups and who are then negotiating exit. This, however, in programming is really underestimated. So this is really under the radar. It's happening already, but not being supported in a very structured fashion. Then on the other side, women are often regarded in these spaces as the victims. And of course, that's true. For the majority, they are forcibly recruited. They are picked up by the groups. But there's also women who are actively joining the groups and who joined willingly. And again, these women are completely under the radar. And what's happening actually in Nigeria is that women immediately are singled out. So they are women, so they come to a different site. They are not screened. They are not handled in the same way as men, which of course means that if you have women who are really radicalized and who are supporting the groups, and then there's no effective screening and prosecution taking place, there's a big gap there. And the armed groups are also deliberately using women for different purposes. They are often sent back to communities from sort of, let me call it the battlefield, or the places where the armed groups are operating, to rather safe havens where they surrender, then they are sent to these havens, and then sort of this is a safe space for them, but where they of course remain or maintain the linkage to the group. Last word maybe on transitional justice. With this, I hand over to you, Milena, and then we can go into Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. Very quickly, how to come to terms now in these areas where mass atrocities, of course, have happened. Transitional justice is an opportunity. However, that we saw requires some more careful consideration, as we have very varying understandings of transitional justice mechanisms in the different localities. Some put it as a synonym actually to traditional justice, as oftentimes we have practices of customary law, for instance. You see practices of swearing on the Quran, etc., which are then, of course, mechanisms who can be used within transitional justice frameworks, but we see that there's not, let's say, a unified understanding of what transitional justice would actually mean. In other cases, we also see that communities, and colleagues have alluded to this, find themselves at very different stages, right, in conflict trajectory. So you have some areas where attacks are still frequent, in other areas where it's less so. So we see that we're at different stages. Forcing now to say transitional justice mechanisms, which of course already demand in a certain way for reconciliation, might be too early in certain stages, and also oftentimes do not take into consideration what is currently needed, restorative or retributive forms of justice. And sometimes also when it comes to involvement of international actors, who oftentimes within a very short time frame, you know how this goes. Like we have projects which are limited, 6 months, you do community dialogues, etc. So it sometimes feels that things are rushed in a way that, oh, now you're done. Forgiveness can be attributed now. So this is actually what we saw in many cases, that communities are not ready, are declared ready. So this is a bit of a mechanism that we call, to say, forced forgiveness, which might actually entrench further grievances. So should be looked at very carefully to not rush these things that take time.